Okay, maybe Ambassador. Ambassador, your mic is muted. Okay, let's start the webinar on Asia and Europe cooperation or competition in gas. My name is Wean Hu, Research Fellow at CEPS. Let me first invite Ambassador Toru Morikawa, Executive Director from Asia Europe Foundation, to deliver his welcome remarks. This event is a collaboration between CEPS and the Asia Europe Foundation based in Singapore. Ambassador Morikawa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Greetings from Singapore. My name is Toru Morikawa, Executive Director of Asia Europe Foundation, ASEF. Let me start by reiterating ASEF's statement on the 1st of March, ASEM Day, our appeal for peace and dialogue, and our thoughts with the innocent people on the ground, which are concretized by our recent contribution to the humanitarian assistance in the area of infectious diseases for them. I would now like to thank the Center for European Policy Studies, CEPS, for initiating and giving ASEF the opportunity to take part in this webinar on the important theme of Asia-Europe cooperation or competition in gas. This is an important but a huge question to respond. For ASEF, sustainable development and the issue of energy are but two sides of the same coin. Sustainable development is in fact one of ASEF's 7 key thematic areas. We align our work with the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development as well as the COP process. It is already April and winter is officially over, arguably reducing the overall demand for heating. However, the question remains, how to ensure a secure and cost-effective supply of energy while minimizing the carbon footprint? BP's statistical review of World Energy 2020 pointed out that fossil fuels still accounted for 84% of the world's primary energy consumption in 2019, followed at a distance by hydropower 6%, renewables 5%, and nuclear power 4%. How to minimize the impact on the energy market and the efforts tackling the climate change of the current geopolitical situation is already a focus of discussion in Europe. While how to meet the rapidly growing energy demand, not impeding the efforts against the climate change in Asia continues to be one of priority issues. It may be necessary to work on the innovation in all directions, such as zero-emission thermal power plant. I hope that this webinar would contribute to such interregional debate, and the ASF would continue to be a part of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now, following Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and now Europe is struggling to wean itself off its dependency on Russian gas. We in Europe will face some eventualities, such as fuel switch, energy saving. And that also means we will depend more on gas imports from other markets. How that will impact the gas market globally, and what kind of dynamics will be played out between the different markets. And I have a panel of experts to share with us their insights on the topic. Let me introduce first Daniel Gross, SEP's Distinguished Fellow and Robert Schuman Fellow at the European University Institute based in Florence, and Jacqueline Tao, who is analyst at Transition Zero based in Singapore. And lastly, I have James Henderson, chairman of the gas program at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. And this webinar is live streamed on the SEP's YouTube channel. For our audience, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box. And if your question is dedicated to a particular speaker, please indicate so. Without further ado, let me pass the floor to Daniel. Please, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Raina, and many thanks to the ambassador for the kind words of introduction. First of all, I have to make a disclaimer. I'm not an expert. The true experts will speak after me, Jacqueline and James. And I take the liberty as a non-expert and non-particularly knowledgeable of the gas market to throw out some, let's say, general remarks. And I very much hope Jacqueline and James will then correct me if I'm wrong, so that we can then have a fruitful discussion. With your permission, Raina, I would like to share my screen. Let me just push the button here. Okay. I hope you can see my screen now. Whoop. Sorry, I'm just trying to make it full screen. Voila. Okay, there we go, I hope. So let me immediately start with a few key points which I wanted to throw out to the experts. So the first point is that basically LNG will be a very scarce resource over the next few years, as the pipeline deliveries to Europe will be reduced by basically action by the European Union not wanting to take any more Russian gas. Second point I wanted to make is that Europe and Asia are effectively one market for LNG, because they're both importing LNG. The US is decoupled because the US only exports LNG and is constrained by its export capacity. And then I wanted just to point out to something which I do not understand very well, and maybe my colleagues can explain us a bit more, which is that there's a very large difference at present between the spot prices, about which we read in the newspapers, and the actual paid by importers. And one explanation of that might be long-term contracts, and I wanted to say something about their role in the present crisis. So just to keep things in mind, my perspective is not the next 10 years, but basically the next 1 or 2 years, where the overriding political aim for Europe is basically how to come to get through the next winter without Russian gas. The ambassador said, okay, now we have a few summer months where we don't need a lot of gas, but if we don't go into the winter with full reservoirs, we'll have a problem, right? And if you go into the winter without full reservoirs and without a flow of Russian gas, we have a big problem. And I wanted to address that in two different steps. First of all, my my first proposition was that Europe and Asia are basically integrated. I think they're integrated because at least my layman's view is that once you have loaded LNG on a tanker, it doesn't really matter whether it goes from Australia up north to Japan or what is it, west to Europe. Or if you have a tanker leaving Qatar, it also really doesn't matter that much whether it goes west or east. So in terms of LNG, the two markets should be integrated. And I think you can see the entire chart because on my screen, your faces cover part of the chart. But I think you can see the entire chart. You see that the Asian and the European markets are very integrated. You might not be able to see the details, but you should see a blue line, which is TTF, European price, and the orange line, which is JKM, Japan, Korea, and Malaysia, I think. For the energy experts, nothing new. But for the layman, I think this is interesting to see that these two markets, there are some differences, but they really go together compared to the blue line, which is here at the bottom, which is the Henry Hub HH, which is United States price, which you see basically since April has moved a lot, whereas the other prices have skyrocketed by a factor of 4 or 5. You can ignore for the time being the EUA line, which is the carbon price on the European emissions trading system, which for me today doesn't play a big role. I don't know whether Jacqueline wants to comment on that. So basically, to repeat, Asia and Europe are integrated, and US is an island, a happy island for the time being, because of the limited export facilities of gas. Now, if the two are integrated, then the reality says that basically Europe and Asia are in competition. They're in competition for the existing pool of LNG, which I take in the very short run very much as given. I don't think Qatar, Australia, anybody else can within 1 year ramp up production a lot. So I take the global supply of LNG in the short run as given. 4 or 5 years out, completely different, but just that is for my key starting point. On top of that, Asia, especially China, is still growing. So they're adding to demand. The US is, of course, an exporter, but as I said, its export capacity is more or less fully used. And it really doesn't really matter whether it goes left or right, whether the US, for political reasons, say, okay, we sell more to Europe, then they have less to sell to Asia. So it goes into one pond and it doesn't really matter, right? So that's why I think there's very much, if you want, the competition as for any, whatever, group of people who need a certain commodity, and they both address themselves to the same market. Now, we are, of course, meeting today because we have this war going on in Ukraine. I think we all agree that this is totally unjustified and that the atrocities committed by Russia are unexcusable. Our topic today is more, let's say, factual. What is the impact on the war itself, on the supply and demand picture for natural gas / LNG? And the primary impact would come through the fact that the European Union wants to stop the import of gas from Russia. Most of which, but not all of which, is piped gas, right? And the rough calculation, and here I think James will be able to provide much more precise numbers, are that before the war, Russia provided about 150 BCM to Europe, which was around a bit more than 30% of EU use. And the question was, okay, if we no longer want to import that for Europe, does it mean that we have to reduce our own consumption by 30%? Which of course would be a very large adjustment to have. And the answer is, I will see in a minute, no. And the second question, of course, is the global supply of natural gas is reduced only if Russia cannot sell the gas which is no longer exported to Europe to nobody else, right? And let me address these two issues one after another. And again, I ask for correction or additions from James and Jacqueline, because they are the experts. So, okay, let's assume that Europe no longer imports anything from Russia. So that means 150 BCM less. Now, Russia then has ceteris paribus 150 BCM available. What does it do with them? So my rough calculation is that about 30 BCM for the non-initiated, that is billion of cubic meters, they could export via existing pipelines and LNG facilities to other customers. I just don't know. Maybe it's 50, maybe it's more or less. I don't know. It's very difficult to say. That means that the global supply of gas would be reduced by around 120 BCM. Right? I'm taking a full calendar year here, usually. Right? So let's say from today to, or let's say if the European embargo comes in June, from June to June. Right? This is all on an annual basis. Global supply then therefore is being reduced by 120 billion cubic meters. And let me now take this hits a market which is dependent on imports of gas of Europe and Asia together, which is around 1,300 BCM. So the overall reduction in gas usage, which one would need to make up for the shortfall, would be around 10% in both markets. Right? I very much repeat, Europe can hope to import more from Asia, only if, of course, Asia, there's less demand for LNG. Right? And so therefore, you need a reduction of about 10 percentage points in both markets. Can that be achieved? And here again, I'm appealing to the specialists. Even if you have a low short run, I repeat, short run elasticity of demand, if the price doubles, it should be possible to get a reduction in demand of around 10%. I'm not talking about very short run 1 month, but over a year. If that should be the case, then perhaps present prices should be enough to reduce gas demand in both markets by an amount which would be approximately equal to the shortfall of Russian gas, which remains then pent up in Russia because it can no longer be exported via the existing pipeline to Europe. The implication, of course, is that the European embargo on the import of Russian gas has an external effect on Asia in terms of the terms of trade of Asia, which deteriorate because the gas price, at least initially, will go up. Again, I'm not talking about 10 years out when things might have come back to normal, but I'm talking about the next year or so. There's a question here whether actually the war was the main driver, because as the energy experts always point out, the gas price had already increased before the war and has not continued to increase after the war broke out. Maybe that's worth a comment. I don't know why that is the case. That would actually argue for a situation in which it was increasing Asian demand because the recovery there, which drove up gas prices, and not so much the political tensions in Europe. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, I have this phenomenon, I wanted to point out this phenomenon, which the experts perhaps can explain better, that the spot price in Europe, which is the, the mauve line labeled EU, has increased by, let's say, roughly 4 times over the average of the last 5 years. It has gone up by more than 5 times, 4 times when you take the trough of gas prices just the last year or the year before. But if you take the average over the previous years, that's gone up 4 times. But then I looked also at the prices actual paid. And the prices actual paid you can get from the balance of payment statistics. You get the total amount, let's say, German importers pay for gas. And you divide that by the total quantity they're importing. So the unit price, which is the price presumably they actually pay, which is at present about 1/2 of the spot price. So the prices actually paid have doubled. The prices we read about in the press, and which might be relevant for electricity price and others, are 4 times higher. So is that just the difference between the marginal cost and the average cost? Spot prices presumably are only meant to be valid for small quantities you need in addition to your base load. But it seems at present that the marginal is really very much larger than the average cost. And what is actually integrated in Europe, if you look at the prices which I showed earlier, was the marginal cost, right? The spot prices. In the previous chart which I showed, it's more difficult to see because the average cost, which is much lower, which was the lower lines, is actually also very similar between Asia and Europe, with a slight Asian premium, but which is of an order of magnitude lower than the price increases we have seen. So if you have these very high marginal costs, should you not have a very high elasticity of substitution if fuel substitution kicks in power generation, right? So that is, for me, one of the unresolved questions. And then finally, let me come back to something which is very often mentioned. Apologies for the misspelling in the title. So the question is, does the price matter when you have long-term contracts? And I think the importance of these long-term contracts is overrated, at least in these exceptional present circumstances when you have extreme price movements. Long-term contracts, they define property rights, but in principle, they should not impede the price mechanism to work. And to make it just, make a concrete example, let's take an Asian power producer, which is locked in a long-term contract at a low price. So that power producer could just continue to use gas. But if it were able to sell its contract to somebody else and then switch to coal or oil, it might make a very large profit. So I think European producers should be able to bribe Asian producers out of their long-term contracts and redirect some cargo to Europe. They might have to pay an additional bribe or additional compensatory payment to the producers who might have had destination clauses. But the main point is that the existence of long-term contracts should not impede the price mechanism to work if the marginal cost has more than doubled, right? And again, I invite the colleagues, experts to comment on that. So let me conclude. Europe's desire to become independent of Russian gas would mean on net a reduction in global supplies of gas, mostly via LNG, of around 120 BCM. And this is a global market because Europe and Asia are integrated. And therefore the lost supply, or the missing supply rather, has to be distributed over Europe and Asia, with prices going up on both sides, and maybe both sides having a relatively, let's say, small but still significant reduction in consumption, which would allow us both Europe, or let's say mainly Europe, to live without Russian gas, at least for the next winter. Let me stop here, Wenyan.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I should say your layman's assessment is very insightful as well. And now, please let me give the floor to Jacqueline. Jacqueline, if you would like to comment on Daniel's presentation, you are more than welcome to. And now we should like to hear your insights on the war's impact on Asia's energy transition. And we have a question here on the impact on climate change. Maybe you could address that as well if there's an opportunity during your presentation. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ian. So let me just share my slides really quick. Are you guys seeing it well? Okay, great, perfect. Right, thanks, Ian, and the colleagues at CFAS and ASAF for inviting me to speak at this event. Hello, everyone. My name is Jacqueline, and in the next 10 to 15 minutes or so, I'll be sharing some of my thoughts on, what is happening with the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict and how that is impacting Asia's energy transition with a focus on Southeast Asia. But before I start, I'd just like to take this chance to express my deepest condolences to people who have friends, family, loved ones who are Ukraine, and for people of Ukraine, and hope that peace will really return to Ukraine and Europe really soon. Of course, I think as we are sitting in the comfort of our homes, I think it's important not to lose sight of the scale of human suffering and destruction that millions are experiencing in Ukraine. And I also like to take this opportunity to really applaud ASAF's humanitarian contributions to and financial support to the World Health Organization's humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. Right. So now, before I start, I'd just like to give a quick introduction on, Transition Zero. So Transition Zero, we're actually a not-for-profit climate analytics organization established to, attempt to clarify complexity of data transparency. And we actually do this by developing open data and open source projects to support economic and financial decision-making in the power as well as heavy industry sectors. And the work of Transition Zero has been funded primarily by philanthropies, with our funders listed below. Right. To start off, I'll just like to quickly highlight the speed and scale of the economic growth that Southeast Asia has really experienced. So from 1990 onwards, despite some hiccups along the way, such as the Asian financial crisis in 1997, the global financial crisis in 2008, and so on, the countries in Southeast Asia has really experienced, on average, a quadrupling of their economies on a real-term basis. And much of this economic growth since the start of the 21st century is actually powered by fossil fuels. So we see coal generation in the power mix in ASEAN countries expanding by 5 times from 2000 to 2017. In comparison, gas generation has only expanded at half the speed, at 2.5 times, albeit from a larger base. So in recent years, so specifically from 2017 to 2020, we see this kind of trend sort of reversing, with gas generation scaling up much more rapidly rapidly than coal between 2017 and 2020. Now, the return of favor of gas has somewhat been spurred by climate change concerns that's rising across political agendas for Southeast Asian countries. Now, out of the 5 Southeast Asian countries that we have looked at, all of them actually have announced net zero commitments with varying levels of ambition. So that includes Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and Thailand. So more interestingly, we have actually seen some of the countries increase or strengthen their climate ambitions, so bring forth their net zero timelines, and that includes Indonesia as well as Singapore. So what this kind of illustrates is that, unlike the past decades where Southeast Asia was able to rely on cheap but dirty coal to power their economic growth, the next wave of economic expansion in the region would really have to be balanced with growing climate change concerns. Now, the need to address rising emissions have sort of made gas much more attractive in ASEAN's generation mix. So on average, give and take efficiency, thermal efficiency, chain differences and kind of technologies that you're employing for thermal fleets. Coal plants typically emit around 1,000 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, while gas plants emit less than half of that even on a life cycle basis. So the chart on the left that you see here has the life cycle emissions for each of the power generation technologies up here, and the bracketed ones are actually the emissions emitted at a combustion stage, or at the power generation stage only. So the difference in the emissions intensity of coal versus gas has sort of explained the expected pivot towards natural gas, which is the cleaner fossil fuel, as the engine of Southeast Asia's growth in the coming decades. So we see that being reflected in forecasts of generation mix. So this forecast here is provided by AREA, the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, which sees gas generation expected to almost triple to reach 1,300 terawatt hours in 2050. That represents around 45% of the generation mix in the region. So these expectations of increased gas generation displacing coal generation in the power mix has sort of combined with declining domestic production across Southeast Asian countries, particularly large gas producers such as Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia, has really spurred the expected growth of LNG markets in Southeast Asia. So if you look at a lot of the commercial forecasts out there, you see Southeast Asia as a region being one of the star performers or expected star performers for the LNG market, and would be set to drive the LNG growth in the next decades. Now, the ongoing Russian-Ukraine conflict has sort of thrown the overall LNG market and energy market into a bit of a disarray. So what you see here is LNG spot prices in East Asia, as proxied by the JKM, which is like the Japan Korea marker assessed by Platts, has really reached unimaginable heights of $85 per MMBTU, and that is from $3 to $5 during pandemic times. So that's kind of really unimaginable heights. That's really divorced from any economic or financial fundamentals at a supply stage. And even traditionally stable coal prices have also been hit. We see that the lower grade Newcastle coal of around 5,500 kcal, the grade hitting 295 or close to 3,000, about $300 per ton per metric ton for metric ton. So this is the kind of prices that we are seeing right now. And actually, with no clear signs of a peaceful resolution in sight, the future prices of these energy commodities are expected to hold relatively steady, and that will really affect the long-term LNG pricing in Asia. So the chart on the left here kind of represents the range of prices that Southeast Asian LNG buyers will be likely to see. That includes the LNG spot price, which is again proxied by JKM, plus I think $1.5 per MMBTU for regas, and then the bar charts, shaded line chart here actually showcases the expected long-term LNG pricing that is proxied by oil, that is indexed to oil at varying slopes of 11 to 14%, plus a constant and regas tariff. So actually, based on our estimates, that's based on forward-looking Brent prices as well as JKM prices. LNG term prices are going to be consistently cheaper than spot prices. That really offers a kind of a shield for LNG or buyers in Southeast Asia, and that's because they kind of procure majority of the LNG based on long-term contracts. So during periods of where LNG prices are really, really low, what typically happens is gas buyers would nominate down to the minimum take-or-pay levels for their term contracts, choosing to purchase them on the spot market instead, so capitalizing on that differential and making like sort of a profit on that. But right now, during periods of really a very high gas price environment, LNG buyers in Southeast Asia who have long-term contracts would typically tend to nominate on the higher end of the the contracted volumes and trying to cover that or to meet most of the gas demand based on this long-term contract, and we minimize the exposure to the spot LNG price that is unreasonably high. So what this actually translates is that the gas price that we are going to see in Southeast Asia based on expected long-term LNG contract prices are going to hold steady at between $12 to $16 per MMBTU in the next kind of 2 years. And that actually translates to a fuel price itself of around $68 to $92 per megawatt hour. And that assumes like a thermal efficiency conversion of around 60% for CCS plant or CCGT plants in the region. So then if you place that and compare it side by side against the average electricity tariffs in the region, you can see that affordability is going to be a key concern for Southeast Asia's pursuit of gas. So electricity tariffs in Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia are unable to cover even the fuel costs associated with this LNG deliveries. Taking note that currently Vietnam doesn't import any gas, it actually produces its own gas, so this electricity price does not include any exposure to LNG prices. And even the rest of the countries, end users will really have to see higher electricity tariffs to accommodate for higher and rising gas generation costs. Now, we expect the impact of this commodity prices to be the most severe for emerging LNG buyers such as Vietnam and Philippines, who are going into negotiating tables amid this really sky-high LNG spot price and a tightening market that might not ease until a few years later, maybe in 2024. And we see that being directly represented in lower bargaining prices, resulting in higher indexations to oil, weaker terms and lower bargaining powers in general. We see that also being the case in Thailand, who's looking to LNG to supplement declining domestic production in its key LNG production blocks in Erawan, Bangkok, in the Gulf of Thailand. So on the flip side, what we're seeing is that there is actually a declining cost profile for renewables that's making renewables look increasingly attractive. What this slide really showcases is IHS Markit's cost competitiveness of gas generation of CCGT plants or combined cycle gas plants vis-a-vis solar generation. So what this clearly illustrates is the financial attractiveness of renewable energy in the region, taking note that this assessment was actually published back in 2020, where LNG and gas prices are a lot lower than what is currently standing at today. So with the current high price environment, we are only going to see the argument strengthen for renewables and against fossil gas plants. Now, the last point that I really like to make here is the impact of increasing renewable energy deployment to strengthen the energy security concerns in the region. So the ongoing energy crisis really illustrates the importance of energy security and energy self-sufficiency. Now, this is a matrix that typically renewable energy fares a bit better at. So, just a suggestion, or personally, I was just thinking that perhaps, in the face of rising geopolitical tensions globally and the uncertainty and potential disruptions as a result of the global energy transition, it is perhaps worthwhile to take a step back and consider the potential deployment of renewables instead of only considering diversification of fossil fuel suppliers and import regions as a way to deal with the current energy crisis. Now, I'd like to end off here quickly with some of the parting thoughts. we do realize that in our assessment, what we are relying on is, short-term price signals to assess potential impacts on long-term investment decisions, particularly for LNG to power projects with a lifespan of around 20 to 30 years, as well as, potential LNG import infrastructures and so on. But so I guess there is really that disjoint between short-term price signals and this long-term decision-making. But we'd like to highlight that, despite this inconsistency, there are a lot of signals and potential influence of this short-term price fluctuations on the political or social acceptance of LNG projects or gas projects or even energy projects in the region. So if you look back at the history of most of the LNG to power projects that were proposed in the region, particularly in Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, we note that this projects typically were accepted into power development plans or really gained momentum in the past 2 to 3 years where market prices are low, indicating that there is an influence of short-term LNG spot market LNG signals or a general,
Okay, apologize for this internet disruption from Singapore. And I will now give the floor to James, who will give us his insights on the Asia-Europe competition in gas. And at the same time, James, maybe you could also address this question in terms of the Africa market and also the EU-US agreement on increasing gas suppliers to the EU market. Thank you very much, James. The floor is yours.
Sure, I will do my best to address those questions. Thank you again for the invitation to speak. Just put my slides up. Oops, there we go. Right, so I hope you can see those. Yes, thanks very much for the invitation to speak. I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of European energy or gas situation, obviously with relevance to the war in Ukraine, which, as with other speakers, we obviously deplore here in Oxford, and our sympathies go out to all those Ukrainians who have been caught up in it. In terms of prices, I won't reiterate what others have said about prices spiking and coming back down again. I guess all I will note, interestingly, in the short term, is that we have seen very significant high prices, and as Daniel mentioned, that was to do with some supply and demand fundamentals in 2021, cold winters, lack of wind at times, gas backup for renewables, and in the fourth quarter, a gradual reduction in Russian supply on the spot market, not contract market, but the spot market. At the moment, prices have come back dramatically from their highs, their ultimate highs, because in the very short term, the market is actually reasonably supplied. Of course, the risk and what the market is nervous about is a potential either cut off of Russian supply or an EU embargo on Russian gas. So the price actually includes really a lot of nervousness about the future rather than the present, where the market is actually relatively fully supplied. In terms of what's been going on in Europe, what we've really been seeing is that drop off in pipeline supply, and that's mainly due to a reduction in Russian supplies in the fourth quarter of last year, but also particularly in the first quarter of this year, as a number of market anomalies have come into play. It's interesting to note that the fall off in Russian supply is not to do with Gazprom reducing supply specifically. It's to do with European buyers not nominating for Russian gas under their contracts, which is rather interesting. They've actually preferred in some months to buy on the spot market because the spot market in Europe has sometimes been lower than the contract price. That's not true in Asia, but it has been true in Europe because contract prices in Europe are not just linked to oil prices, they're linked to the hub prices in Europe as well. So there's been some market anomalies around that, but nevertheless, Russian gas supply has been reduced, and LNG, particularly, as you can see in the red, has been what has filled the gap. And to Daniel's earlier point, the LNG market is clearly global, so this implies competition with all buyers of LNG. Here's a quick graph showing how the EU's LNG imports have risen, particularly in 2022. So we have seen sellers from all over the world, particularly from the US, but also from Qatar and Africa, as one of the questioners has mentioned, bringing LNG into Europe based on price competition, and also based, interestingly, to Daniel's point about the US being indifferent whether to send gas west or east, actually, interestingly, to do with the fact that the transport distance from the Gulf of Mexico to Europe is about half that to Asia. So actually there is a difference in A, the amount of time it takes to get LNG to different markets, and B, the cost, therefore. So it's been interesting that US LNG has been heading to Europe, not just based on price, but based on transport capacity as well. So we've really seen this surge, and it's been based on the fact that in 2022, there is more LNG available to the world. So in 2021, one of the reasons that prices spiked earlier, before any thought of a Ukraine conflict emerged, was because there were a number of outages in LNG plants, unexpected outages, and there was also not much new LNG being developed. And so actually in 2021 compared to 2020, there was a 10 BCM decline in LNG available to the world. This is in 2022 going to flip back, and because many of the outages we saw in 21 will be reversed, and because there is new supply coming online, particularly from the US, then we're going to see in 2022 export capacity increase by about 40 BCM plus. So actually the situation looks a little bit better than it did. That's clearly not enough gas to replace the 150 BCM that we could lose if the Russian imports to Europe are embargoed. But nevertheless, it's certainly a better situation than 2021. Unfortunately, it may not be repeatable in 2023 and 24, because once the reversals have happened, they're not going to happen again, and the sources of new supply are somewhat limited in the next couple of years before we get back to a more helpful situation in 2025. Nevertheless, having said that, one of the key markers of the volumetrics of the gas market are European storage levels, because Europe really acts as the balancing market for the global LNG market. And when European storage levels are very low, that means the market is really very tight and prices can be expected to be high. But when European storage is relatively full, that means the global market is relatively plentiful with supply. Now, what we've seen in basically the winter 2021-22 is that you can see the black line is storage levels. We started the winter with very, very low storage levels because historically, because gas supply had been used over the summer to replace some of these outages I've talked about. Also in power generation, because the wind didn't blow as much as expected in August, September, gas-fired power generation was used to back up the power system in Europe. And so gas was not being injected into storage. So the market was tight as we came into the fourth quarter. And then, as I mentioned, there was a sort of decline in Russian gas supply to Europe in the fourth quarter. And so you can see that storage levels were very low throughout the fourth quarter of 21 and into the first quarter of 2022. But now, because of a relatively warm winter, because there has been this surge in LNG supply, and because actually Russian gas supply has bounced back a bit in March. In fact, since the invasion of Ukraine, Russian gas supply to Europe has increased, not declined. We've seen storage levels rise. So the storage situation at the moment is moving back towards some form of normality, meaning that physically the market is actually pretty much in balance at the moment. Of course, there's obviously the risk going forward that things will change dramatically. If they do change dramatically, this graph tells you what would the impact of an embargo on Russian gas would be on those storage stocks. So we are currently at around 25 to 30 billion cubic meters of gas in storage. If you take out all Russian gas from now, then because we have arrived in the summer, as the ambassador highlighted, and because demand for heating will decline, and because we do have some gas in storage and more LNG on the market, our stocks, which is the blue bar, can last until the end of summer. We can get through the summer and storage goes to zero by September. But by the time we hit the winter, there's no gas left in storage. And you can see then the blue bar goes very, very negative. I mean, this effectively is substitution, but it's not substitution. It's actually demand destruction. And what you're seeing here is not just substitution related to elasticity. It's actually the shutting down of industrial plants. It's the unavailability of gas-fired power stations. It is something of an economic catastrophe for Europe. And the orange bar are slightly more optimistic. They show what happens if some of the mitigation measures that have been suggested by the IEA and indeed the European Commission are put into place. But you can see, even with those mitigation in place, the storage still runs out by the end of December, and we get into very negative storage balance, i.e. demand destruction again, as we go into 2023. So it looks like a pretty drastic situation from a gas economy perspective for Europe if we completely embargo Russian gas. Now the EU and the European Commission has obviously come up with a plan. Although there's talk of embargoes on Russian gas, the actual plan proposed so far is a 2/3 reduction to reduce EU imports from about 155 billion cubic meters to just over 100. And there are various ways that have been suggested to do that, and they are supply side measures and they're also demand side measures. The supply side, there's been a question about, can Africa provide more gas? Well, yes, it can, a little bit. There's not a huge surplus capacity of gas in North Africa for Europe, but some pipeline imports from North Africa, some extra from Norway. If maintenance is deferred, we could see 10 BCM of pipeline gas imports. The big one, though, is the LNG in the world. And we're looking, or the EU are looking for an extra 50 billion cubic meters of gas. I've mentioned there'll be 40 BCM extra this year versus last. Of course, Europe's not the only buyer of LNG. So what would actually be available left for Europe? Probably around half that when you take into account demand from other sources, particularly Asia. So there's going to be competition in the gas market without any doubt for at the margin. So that spot price is certainly potentially going to rise significantly if Europe really tries to diversify away from Russian gas. There is clearly a demand side dynamic here. We are talking about more rapid implementation of wind and solar at a system level, which could save 20 BCM. We're talking about energy efficiency, particularly what's been mentioned by the IEA, turning down thermostats, which could save around 14 BCM. And you can see some other sort of smaller savings there. So demand side is going to be important, but it's not, certainly on what's proposed so far, enough to mitigate either a partial or even a full embargo on Russian imports. So we are talking not just about demand elasticity, we're talking about demand destruction here. All the while, of course, Asian demand continues to rise. This is a long-term graph. In the short term, high prices are impacting demand growth, but over the longer term, we're expecting demand growth to be led again, as has been in the past, by China in terms of overall volumes, which is the yellow bar in the graph on the left. But actually, some of the smaller emerging Asia LNG importers are showing the fastest growth. So countries like Vietnam, which has been mentioned already, is using domestic gas, but could start to import. But many of the other countries like Thailand, like Pakistan, like Bangladesh are increasingly importing LNG. So we certainly see a rising demand in Asia, and therefore, bigger competition in that global LNG market. In 2022, in the very short term, as I've mentioned, high prices are having an impact. So we don't really see that much growth other than from China. There is some small growth in ASEAN countries as well. But over the longer term, we certainly see competition emerging. So I think in the short term, the question of balancing with Asia turning to other fuels potentially because of high price gas is certainly something to be borne in mind. But over the longer term, the competition is certainly going to be there. I just want to highlight the short term. It's a bit of a complex graph, but what it tries to highlight is factors that are loosening or tightening the market. So the blue bars show helpful, if you like, initiatives to the market, whereas the red show unhelpful, tightening. In Europe, we actually expect demand to be a bit lower in 22 than it was in 21, impact of higher prices, also more normal weather conditions, assuming we get a cold winter this coming winter. But on the negative side, production continues to decline. We're going to see lower Russian imports even before we take into account any embargo. We're probably not going to see higher imports from other sources unless it's really pushed. So this is kind of an analysis done before the crisis. And you can see that LNG imports were going to have to rise even before we had the current crisis. They're going to come from the global LNG market where there is surplus capacity. There is also extra demand from global markets. So what we're showing here is even before the crisis, the real impact on European storage, which actually there's no change in European storage, suggests that the market is going to remain tight even before you took into account what I put in the dotted lines there, the potential dramatic decline in Russian pipe imports. So the main message from this graph is even before we were even thinking about whether we might decline Russian imports dramatically, we were already looking at a market where European storage was not seeing any increase, compared to the previous year in storage levels, which implied that the market would still remain pretty tight. So if Russian supply goes much lower, of course, the situation gets significantly worse. Talking about LNG, though, again, 22 I've mentioned is a tight market, but actually what this graph shows is the utilization of LNG capacity in the world. And what you can see here is utilization is very high in 2022. It's a very tight market. There's a lot of competition, but that utilization doesn't really go down until 2025, 26. So actually 2023 and 24 are also going to be difficult years for the global gas market. And again, if we take out a significant amount of Russian gas, that's only going to make the situation worse. To reiterate a point that was made by Daniel, the gas that's being piped to Europe, which is around 140 BCM of gas, can't really go anywhere else. The pipes to Asia use different sources of Russian gas. The only thing where there's flexibility is Russian LNG, which can shift from Europe to Asia, and that's about 20 BCM of gas. So we really are talking a very, very tight market in terms of LNG, in 23 and 24. And if you take out Russian gas to Europe, the situation, frankly, becomes pretty much unfeasible. There just isn't enough gas in the world available in the next 3 years to replace that Russian gas. In Asia, I want to come on to the topic of pricing, which has been brought up by both the previous speakers. And one of the reasons why actually the competition could be more intense and we'll see less price elasticity is because in Asia, as I touched on earlier, there is a significant amount of oil-linked pricing. These graphs are from the IGU World Wholesale Gas Price Survey for 21. And you can see that the dark blue in the graph on the left shows oil-linked pricing, OPE, oil price equivalent pricing. And you can see in Europe, it's practically zero. Whereas in Asia Pacific and Asia, it's up at 50 and 60%. And in Asia Pacific, as you can see in the pie chart on the right, it's well over 60%. So the impact of current high spot prices is not really being felt in Asia. And again, this is a kind of similar graph to the one that Jacqueline showed. It shows the coal price to Japan. This is all in US dollars per MMBTU for equivalence. The coal price to Japan relative to the spot price, which is obviously way higher than the coal price, but then relative to the oil-linked contract price, where they're actually pretty equivalent. So to be honest, as has been pointed out, the incentive for buyers who have contracted for gas under long-term contracts linked to the oil price is actually to nominate pretty high to increase their demand for LNG, because actually at the moment, you don't want to be buying spot gas for sure. And actually, there's not much incentive really even to switch to coal because coal prices are quite high as well. So again, this underlines the fact that there is really this competition between Asia and Europe, and Asian buyers at the moment yet do not have much incentive to do anything other than nominate quite high on their LNG contracts. I would make one point though, which is about the kind of medium-term impact on individual countries. We did some work in Oxford about wholesale gas prices in Asia. And although Asia is used to paying a premium price, within the region, many countries are not used to paying a premium price. There are price subsidies as well. Many countries, such as India particularly, but others like Pakistan, Bangladesh, are not used to paying prices much above $6 an MMBTU. Obviously, prices are way above that at the moment. So nevertheless, there is a potential for demand destruction in Asia as well as in Europe, and a kind of a slowing down of the coal to gas switch, which we had been seeing in the region until now. I've noticed that I'm sort of running out of time, so I'm going to rather move through these slides about coal to gas switching and get to my conclusions, and just say that fundamentals suggest that we're not short of gas at the moment. However, clearly the risk of Russian gas cutoff is for a dramatic change and demand destruction, I would say, in Europe and potentially in Asia as well. We don't expect the LNG supply situation to improve dramatically before 2025. So this is not just a 22 problem, it's a 23 and 24 problem. We do expect, absent a significant demand reaction to high prices, that Asian demand over the long term will continue to grow. Oil linked pricing is masking some of the impact at the moment, but that may unwind. There would appear to be some opportunities for switching back to coal, but mainly in countries where coal is used in the power sector. So I think there is an opportunity for coal switching in the short term. But as Jacqueline's mentioned, one would hope that in the medium to longer term, actually the switching will be towards renewables. But that's a long-term prospect, and short-term gas markets still looking very, very tight, and prices looking to stay high, I would have thought, for at least another 2 years, possibly 3. I'll stop there. Thanks very much indeed, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, James. And unfortunately, we won't have much time for the Q&A, but some of the questions were already answered either during the presentations or by our panelists. I have here one question, and I'm sorry, I will only have time for one question, which is it asks our panelists to describe the mechanics of long-term LNG contracts in a little bit more detail. I wonder who will be able to answer this question? Maybe James?
James here would be better.
James?
Yeah, happy to have a go. I mean, essentially, well, as Jacqueline's kind of mentioned, the long-term contracts are signed for volumes, but there's flexibility. I think the question was around whether there's flexibility. There is flexibility around the annual contract volumes that are contracted for, down to take or pay levels. Effectively, you can nominate down. In some European contracts, you can actually nominate slightly above as well in the short term. But essentially, there is flexibility. When spot prices are low, then buyers would tend to nominate down to the lowest level they can nominate to, the take or pay level, and buy on the spot market. But as Jacqueline pointed out, with spot prices being high, then what you would expect is that buyers will nominate to buy as much gas as they can at lower oil-linked prices for the time being. And that, of course, makes gas less available for Europe. However, to Daniel's point, a buyer of oil-linked gas in Asia has a choice. They can either use that gas or they can resell that gas into a very high-priced spot market in Europe. And so we will see the kind of the turning of some long-term gas from Asia to Europe to take advantage of that massive arbitrage at the moment. I mean, obviously there'll be some gas that kind of has to be used in Asia, and they won't be able to avoid using it. But at the margin, some gas will flow from Asia to Europe. Particularly, I would have thought from Qatar, as buyers are prepared to give up their gas and take that margin. But that doesn't alter the fact that, if you take even 50 BCM out of the market of Russian gas, you tighten the LNG market very significantly. If you take 150 BCM out, well, in the short term, you just can't replace that.
Can I just ask you, James, out of the 150 billion which Europe might no longer ask from Russia, You said only 2030 can be redirected?
No, I sort of said when I was talking about that, I was talking really about the 50 BCM. I mean, I essentially, just looking at the market right now, it would appear to us that there's about 40 BCM of extra gas in the market. We think there's probably for that demand for that of around 15 BCM in Asia, which leaves about 25 BCM of naturally available extra gas in Europe. So, you know, if we only wanted to get rid of 25 BCM of Russian gas, there's enough LNG in the market this year to allow us to do that. If we want to remove a lot more Russian gas and replace it with alternative gas supply, then we are going to struggle. You know, then we are talking about demand side measures having to play a significant role, and that's either voluntary demand side measures, that's increasing the use of renewables, it's switching to coal, or it is demand destruction. It is industrial shutdown because prices are so high that, you know, they can't afford to run their fertilizer plant or their chemicals plant. So I think that at the margin, there's about 25, I would say, to 30 BCM of readily available LNG in the global market in 2022. Anything more than that, and we are talking very significant competition between Europe and Asia.
You have not used the word demand elasticity once.
No, I haven't, because I don't think there is much demand elasticity, actually. We have not seen much. There's certainly not a one-to-one correlation between prices and demand. I mean, you've used the word demand elasticity. I've used the word demand destruction. And I've done that very deliberately because I don't think, I mean, they're obviously at the margin, residential consumers will hopefully turn down their thermostats in reaction to price. And I think there can be some elasticity before we get to destruction. But I think in terms of the numbers we're talking about, you know, 150 BCM, there's no way demand elasticity is going to, you know, allow that kind of swing. I mean, 150 BCM is, in the context of Europe, of the EU demand was about 420 BCM last year. So that's about 40 BCM of EU demand. You can't remove that amount of supply and have demand elasticity, you know, change. And I think in Asia, there can be some shift as well. But I think, again, it's more about destruction of demand rather than elasticity.
My point had been that about, let's say, 120 is missing, not 150. Let's say 120 is missing. Mm-hmm. And that has to be distributed over a common market, Europe and Asia, which is around 1,300 large. So 10%, is that demand destruction or elasticity?
Well, I guess that's an interesting question. I mean, I think in Europe, it certainly looks to us like demand destruction rather than demand elasticity. I mean, in Asia, I'm less clear, but it doesn't look to us. I mean, clearly some will be demand elasticity. I agree with that. You know, the 1,300 is, yeah, total gas market. LNG market is about 550 BCM. So, you know, again, within LNG, which is where the pressure really is being felt, I think there's more demand destruction. But look, I wouldn't disagree. There will be an element of demand elasticity, but I think at 10% of the market, you are talking destruction as well. So where the balance is, I don't know, but I don't think it's all elasticity.
Thank you so much. And with that, I will have to close the webinar. And to our audience, you can watch that the whole webinar again on CEP's YouTube channel. And it's extremely rich, and we can digest by watching them again. And I would like to thank ASAF for co-organizing this event. I would like to also thank to our CEP's communications team for promoting this event. And with that, I wish all of you a very good morning and good afternoon. And let's continue this discussion on gas in future occasions. Thank you very much. Bye. And thank you very much to our speakers.